Well, good morning, good day. Welcome to the ESA Tech webinar. My name is James Rowlingleaf, and I will serve as a moderator for this webinar. Again, happy that you're joining us from wherever you are. I hope you're doing well. Let me begin by introducing myself in my own language. The year 2022 is a decade of Indigenous languages, so I just sort of want to honor that and say, how me dakiapi, friends and relatives, chante washte, from my heart, I greet you, and also Napechu Zapalo, I shake your hand. James Rowlingleaf, Imachiapi na, Sichanga Lakota Oyate, Hemataha. My name is James Rowlingleaf, and I'm from the Rosebud Sioux tribe. So today, Jonathan, would you print that slide up, please? So today, I want to say, Taya Yahipi. Welcome all to our webinar series. Again, this is, I think, the fourth webinar in a one-year plan that we try to do. And we're happy you're with us. Again, we want to practice what we call Lakota protocols. Whether you like it or not, we're going to apply Lakota cultural protocols to our group here. And I just want to say that Lakota protocols, again, it's a way how we interact with one another as human beings, and how we respect one another. And as we listen and learn from our speakers today and how we interact with our questions, again, it's really an aspiration of how we relate and how we respect the knowledge and the person, the wisdom that's given. And so we always do that in a good way. Also, please add your name and organization in the chat, if you will. We really want to know who you are and who's watching, who's listening. We'll also have a question and answer session at the end, Q&A. So please put your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A button. Again, we record these webinars. We want to share this information widely, and we're documenting this work too, so that people who can't be with us will be able to get access to it. And we want that to be done. And so appreciate that, your understanding and your support. Finally, we have evaluations. This work under the ESA Tech section is really all about connecting with our membership and those who want to join ESA. And so we want to understand how these webinars are being received. Are they helpful to you in your work? And if not, how can we improve them? So on to the next slide, Jonathan. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Gwen Bridge. Gwen, I met 2 years ago. And also Gwen's part of our tech section leadership team. She's from the Satellite Cree Nation in Alberta, Canada. And so we're really happy that she wants to be with us today to share her work as she works, as the title says, with ethical space, science, and Indigenous knowledge. Gwen has a master's degree, and she'll go more into her introduction as well, but I just sort of wanted to highlight that she does a lot of work with First Nations in Canada. We recruited her to be part of our section team to help us with not only the programming that we envision, but also going forward and really building a foundation of how we work across all borders, including First Nations in Canada. But we're just happy that Gwen's with us today. And I know, also have to say that Anita Lafferty, who was scheduled to be with us this morning and this day, could not be with us. So we asked Gwen to step in last minute, and she was gracious to do that. Your presentation today.
You're frozen, James.
But I think he may have been handing it off to you, so you want to get started?
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Okay. Okay. As James said, thanks guys for being here and for listening. I'll talk a little bit about this ethical space concept and its importance in relation to science, Indigenous knowledge, and really fundamentally the issues around conflict and reconciliation in ecological management, natural resource management, and relationships in general. So thanks for being here very much, and welcome all. Next slide. So this is just what I want to talk about through this presentation. So really this is beginning to set up things for what's really essentially a new way of envisioning relationships through the future that will support better ecological management across all of North America and indeed throughout the world. So there's three sort of areas that I would really want to talk about is like, why do we want better relationships or collaborations between science and Indigenous knowledge practitioners? Really, when we search ourselves, what are we thinking about? We're thinking about the need to resolve conflicts that perpetuate inequality. We're thinking about the document that was developed by Indigenous people, the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, a global guidance from Indigenous people about their own rights. And we're thinking about how to conserve and manage natural resources sustainably. Those are really important reasons for us to begin to think more deeply about what collaboration means and how that will influence our future. A lot of the conversation coming out of the recent International Union for the Conservation of Nature Congress in Marseille, where I happen to be, and indeed coming up to COP26, a lot of the themes are around the relevance of Indigenous management for preserving and protecting the future resources, both climate dependent resources like temperature and air, but also biodiversity. So what do we need to know when we think about the reasons why we need to do that? What do we need to do in order to better position ourselves to understand what we might need to know to prepare ourselves? So we need to understand UNDRIP in whatever context. It's a really foundational document to these international and national conversations by Indigenous people with those who are interested in engaging. We need to understand reconciliation. This talk will talk a lot about sort of the roots of conflict. It's really important to understand that. And that's, from my perspective and my work, what those might be and how to think through some of them. The structural characteristics of those worldviews, they're not just philosophical considerations. They're really these scaffolding that holds our societies together and influences the way we work. So we'll explore that a little bit as well. And then a really deep understanding of the challenges. So this talk today is to hopefully begin to frame some of those more deeper or foundational considerations, systemic considerations, which are really key to the notion of conflict and subsequently moving through reconciliation. And then what do we do? So when we know why we want to do stuff, and then we sort of have a foundation of a deeper understanding of what some of those issues are, what do we do? What do we do? How do we move forward, right? Trying to be pragmatic in my work always and support you with some considerations, pragmatic considerations that might help your work. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this is really important. It's certainly a document. I'm in Canada, obviously, as James mentioned. I work in Canada. I also work in the States, but I'm from Canada. So I understand the Canadian context. And this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People certainly is an important document that's gaining a lot of traction in Canada, what with the Canadian federal passing of the Bill C-15, which is the need to make all existing legislation and law consistent with UNDRIP, as well as the law in British Columbia, the province in BC, which is required to make all new legislation also consistent with UNDRIP. So as I mentioned before, it forms this, because it was developed over 20 years by Indigenous people throughout the world, it really is a reflection of global Indigenous perspectives on what the nation states of the world need to do to preserve and protect their rights. So it's the highest level of international guidance. It's endorsed by Indigenous people, developed, but it's not legally binding at the United Nations to any nation unless they would choose to make it so, as Canada has done this year after it first endorsed in 2016. The US endorsed with caveats by Obama did in 2010. I'm not as familiar. Some of you probably know the state of that a little bit more. BC, of course, has made commitments to advance UNDRIP implementation. And as I mentioned, this underlies all of the work that we're doing. Those 49 articles are really, really important to think through specific strategies as we go forward. And the international conversation is really, really important as we're thinking about the advancements of conservation and nature-based solutions for climate. What is underpinning that now in some of the new conversations is that since Indigenous people have much better management, indeed on their managed lands, 80% of the biodiversity of the world remains, and also they control territories really important for nature-based solutions for climate mitigation and alternative economic opportunities, right? So as the understanding that Indigenous people are so critical to the preservation of those things we value about our existing world, it's really important to understand UNDRIP. Next slide. So basically, UNDRIP is a cool document, but it's a bit of a slog to read through and really embody. So this is a bit summary. Basically, UNDRIP requires the states to acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights, protect those rights, and to pay to protect, redress, or mitigate impacts to those rights. So it's the whole package really about Indigenous rights and then paying to make sure that they happen. So there's this economic component, which I think is really going to come into play. Next slide. Some weird graphics. So I'm going to talk about some specific articles, not to belabor the point. You can all read UNDRIP on your own, but to really think about what underpins UNDRIP. What underpins UNDRIP and Indigenous rights is that the culture, the language, and the ecology are all interconnected and intertwined. So when we talk about holistic perspective, UNDRIP, I feel, does really represent this. And in these articles, it attempts to sort of break them out or silo them out in its articulation to non-Indigenous people as well, right? So when we're thinking about land management, we're thinking about ecology, we're thinking about holism and relationships to land. Everything is connected, and you've heard that before, but we can get into some of that understanding a bit more too. But basically, just a quick summary. This notion to practice and revitalize cultural, spiritual, and religious traditions. So that includes all ecology, essentially. So next bullet, I guess. These are slow, sorry. So this is just one here. It's like, and also when I talked about economics, the means to subsistence and development is tied to the entire application of ecology when applied by Indigenous people. So it's inseparable. Just another point there. Next bullet slide. This is something, Article 24 and then a subsequent articles, this conservation of vital medicine plants, animals, and minerals, right? And so next bullet. And then, so what's contained within these rights is also these responsibilities, right? So if Indigenous people are indeed going to, are the ones who are preserving most effectively the ecology of the earth, the application of the responsibilities to exercise those rights is really key to UNDRIP, and that includes all lands, waters, and other resources forever, basically, right? Next. And so this is my point too, and we'll get into it when we talk a little bit about where we're going next with the concept of ethical space, is that the Indigenous people's laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems, etc., are recognized as rights in this document. And what's interesting when we talk about science and ecology is that all of the ecological principles, protocols, and prescriptions that come out of Indigenous people's stories are indeed the legislative framework for the behavior of that society. So I think I'll move on now and discuss that further in a moment. That's your cue. Thank you. So this is particularly when we think about ecology as a science, perhaps, we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So, and how science and Indigenous knowledge do really differ. And so science in this context means not only sciences as understood from a non-Indigenous perspective, but all of those things I just mentioned, you're not able to separate science and Indigenous knowledge, story, and law, right? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, so all of those rights are inherent within UNDRIP. Go ahead. So I want to talk a little bit about reconciliation. Reconciliation is a big buzzword in Canada. It's not a concept that's unique to Canada. Canada has been doing work on reconciliation modeled on the South African process of reconciliation. And they came out with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports in 2015 after a series of exercises across the country, which were really initiated by the need to move through the process or begin the process of healing after generations of residential school experiences, which happened both in Canada and the United States. So they came through that work with 94 calls to action. When you read those 94 calls to action, there are fewer of them as compared to UNDRIP, which are explicitly calling out the need to reform land management practices. But what was interesting to me in reading the commission reports is that underlying all of those 94 calls to actions is this recognition that to reconcile, the first relationship that must heal is the relationship of Indigenous people to their land. So I want to make a comment, and I don't know, for international audiences, reconciliation is a concept which is fundamentally about the resolution of conflict. So it's not a uniquely Canadian concept, but I found this really interesting in the context of Indigenous people, is that we talk about all of those rights and UNDRIP, we talk about Indigenous ways, we talk about reconciliation. This notion that we cannot do anything in reconciliation until Indigenous people have reconciled their relationship to the land, right? And what's preventing that? And we all know there's a myriad of challenges associated with that, and we'll explore some of the philosophical underpinnings of that as we go forward. But it's really, really important that if you're going out and talking to Indigenous people and it's like, oh, we need to do this or this or this, or we'd like to have better relations, this concept that the primary relationship that needs to heal is this one with their land. And so before we can do much more, we need to really think about how to support those kinds of things. And what does that mean? That means ethical space. That means a shift into the creativity and exploration of how those supports happen. So we'll move to the next slide. This is just a brief concept that I wanted to talk about. So what does reconciliation mean, right? And so we talk about it's a resolution of conflict, but how do we actually do that, right? And so there's this concept that's around too, the two-eyed scene, or different ways of knowing, or seeing out of both eyes, or whatever. And those are all euphemisms for essentially this notion of ethical space, right? And so what does it mean? It means we develop a shared vision, right? And this metaphor of two-eyed seeing is really, as humans, we have this binocular vision, right? And if we're only seeing out of one eye, the Western or the Indigenous, and we're trying to get somewhere, when we open our both eyes and try and see from both, if we haven't focused on that target or that vision together, we'll be both heading in different directions. You know what I mean, right? And so the point here is that in order to have this function, next slide, in the brain, there's this sort of this collective consolidation of that information that's coming through two eyes. They need to happen concurrently, right? And they need to be built on very deep understanding of what's being seen through that eye. And this concept of ethical space is a really, really good one. Next slide. And it's beautifully and simply articulated in this diagram, which comes from Reg Crowshoe's work, Voices of Understanding, published by the Alberta Energy Regulator. It's the best work I've seen that explains this concept of ethical space really, really well. And what it really means is that in the past, we talked about integration, or we talked about pulling things together, or incorporation, or inclusion of information, which is really more of like, well, let's see how we can put these two, Western circle and Indigenous circle together, right? And see what comes out in the merging. Reg's point was that that's not effective. That's not what we need to really come to an understanding. And so what he proposes is this notion of ethical space. We bring those things from each of those worldviews. We bring a deep understanding of those elements into this ethical space. And really it's a space of creativity to explore and understand new things, new solutions, right? And it's also one of cultural safety, which brings cultural protocols that many of us are not familiar with, that come out of Indigenous communities, and not being afraid to understand those. Next slide. So what's in those cultures? So we know on the Western side, most of us, and indeed most Indigenous people, know them really well because they've been imposed upon them for quite some time. But this is, just a sort of a layperson's list. Okay, there's politicians, there's science, there's religion, there's values, there's patriarchy, there's the Age of Enlightenment, there's democratic governments, there's constitutions, right? All of those things which we're taught in school, and the way we behave embodies the inclusion of those in our value systems and assumptions in how we interact every day. On the Indigenous side, unique to various nations across the whole of North America and the world, is traditional ecological knowledge, stories, protocol, chiefs, for example, different values, Indigenous government systems, which are not typically democratic, spirituality, and community, right? So those are things. And so I think that there's this need for non-Western societies, peoples, to begin to understand what's contained within the TK. Actually, it's required in ethical space that this deeper understanding be brought forward by Indigenous people to enable this ethical space. Next slide. Next. Is that working?
It's really weird. In my screen, it has moved, but on the view, it has not. So let me see if I'm.
Oh, okay.
Is that that's the right one?
Yeah, we're good
Okay.
with that. Thank you. So this is a concept that I came up and one of my colleagues, Rob Edward, and I were thinking about, well, why with all these good intentions that we have with each other and as individuals to work together, there still exists this tension, this conflict, this feeling of misunderstanding, right? And it's like, I always use this example, but you could use any sort of example. A lot of the conversation is really about, well, we would like to reconcile or work together or collaborate or cooperate or whatever the term is when partners and Indigenous peoples want to make some decisions on the land. So, you know, a logging company will be like, well, we want to harvest here. And Indigenous people will say, well, that's our medicine basket, you know, like that's not really a great idea. And so there becomes this conversation around that particular site or that particular topic, which is good and great and may or may not be resolved in the individual case. But it's a conversation which doesn't necessarily resolve conflict because it doesn't explore why those points of view are so different and what's motivating people to adhere to those particular values and sets of guidance, right? So we were thinking about it and it's like, well, where does how do people internalize those value systems and what are the assumptions that they're working under when they're moving through various decisions? And so when we begin to explore that and sort of peel back the layers, we came to this concept, which I'll explore with you and you can see how it resonates for you. And so it's like, okay, well, what fundamentally causes people to behave the way they do and make decisions in the way that they do? It's a cultural construct, right? And so what are those cultural constructs? And so on the Western side, we have God, and in Canada's context, that authority for decisions about the earth and all of the things on the earth get delegated essentially to the Queen, right? The point here, and some of my American friends have said, well, it's not necessarily a queen, but it's basically a human, it's delegated to a human authority, right? And then that human authority, there's a bunch of stuff and constitutions are developed and legislation is done and policy is made. And then I put science in the bottom here and I'll show you, I'll just describe why that is. But this is kind of the authority that governs Western behavior, right? And so on the Indigenous side, and I would just make a caveat, this is based on my experience, my work, who I am, and it's not necessarily a pan-Indigenous framework, but so I just want to make sure that people understand that. There's lots of cool stuff in the world, but basically, like the highest level of authority gets delegated to the actual earth, right? To the animals and the plants and the water and all of that kind of stuff, right? And then the earth delegates that to various components that are referenced through story. Like in the case of Okanagan, for example, there's 4 food chiefs who actually made decisions about humanity. So they were the delegates of these creators' authority, and they made decisions. Humans weren't involved at all in that, right? And so that kind of delegation is described in various stories in Indigenous traditions, right? And then those stories contain protocols. The protocols contain management prescriptions, and then people abide and live by those laws, right? So the point here, the essential point of conflict between these 2 worldviews is that the highest level of authority on the Indigenous side is actually provided to the earth, which then is interpreted through story by humanity and decisions made consistent with the earth-based authority. On the non-Indigenous side, that highest level of authority is essentially provided to the humanity, right? Judeo-Christianity is the one I'm most familiar with, but there are others. And so what does this mean, right? Next slide. So what this means is that, so when I get back to science here, so what is Earth, you know, and how do Indigenous peoples typically observe the Earth? It's through story, right? And we all know that. And then on the Western side, how does scientists and whatnot observe the Earth? They go out and they observe the earth through science typically, right? And the point here that I'm trying to make is that those things are both earth observation-based ways of understanding what the earth is telling us, right? It's like, oh, the earth, we're heating up. Oh, we should not plant, we should pick speedlum in fall or whatever the case may be, right? And so what the difference here is that what the earth tells us on the science side has no inherent legal authority, right? So the climate, and this is exemplified to date, really, and continues to be a challenge in that climate change science, for example, for decades, the earth has been telling us through our storytellers as scientists that there's problems, something needs to get done. But did that make any difference? Not really, because it has to go through this policy validation feedback loop, which is subject to political whims, political aspirations, individual personalities, consistency with other laws, temporal considerations, all that kind of stuff. So we all know how policy works, right? And so this is a big challenge for the saving of ecology in the world, for nature-based solutions for climate change, is that the science carries no inherent authority, no legal weight to actually in itself influence the behavior of us, the societal participants, right? On the Indigenous side, what the earth tells people is the law, right? So the earth says, well, pick whatever and whatever time, or we need to, there's trained people who can interact with the earth and receive guidance from earth entities. And they say, well, we need to do this kind of stuff. That actually carries weight because the earth itself carries a legal authority. The legal authority means, and legislations are those things which constrain our behavior as individuals. And so on the Indigenous side, in traditional sense, this legal authority is very highly weighted, whereas on the Western side, it doesn't really carry any weight. And so when we talk about conflict, this is the understanding that we need to bring towards this, that when we're talking about trying to work with Indigenous people, trying to incorporate information, traditional knowledge, it's like, and this is exemplified. I always use this example. Sorry, Paulus, I saw someone from Paulus on the call, but I was working with them on the watershed management plan. And it was like, we hope this plan will influence policy. We really want to we have some, but we'd like to have more Indigenous knowledge, right? And we hope that this plan will influence policy. And so it's problematic because why would you, as an Indigenous person, allow or endorse the subjugation of the highest level of your law, i.e. your earth observation-based knowledge, to a policy validation feedback mechanism, which is out of your control, right? And so this is, for me, the fundamental, and this is a Christian concept, but sort of genesis of this conflict, right? And so how do we begin to resolve that structural and systemic set of issues? Because next slide, we're all very well intentioned, but it's really difficult to work. So just the one backup from the science to management. So, I mean, this is one of the conclusions, and you see this is all sort of, these are each side of an ethical space, right? And so what's important is to bring this understanding, which I've just described, at a high level, into the space. So if in ethical space, we're obligated as each side to bring that understanding into the space so we can understand it and then develop something new. It's like, well, bringing that understanding about the importance of earth-based observations as law is really critical, because then it's like, like it's not the Constitution, it's not the God, it's this, this traditional stories are the highest level of the law. And so in thinking about, where we go from here, it's that, and I have a dream. Anyway, it's like, well, as we become, not necessarily decolonized, further beyond decolonized is indigenized, right? Where we're taking on a lot more of Indigenous concepts, Indigenous lifeways, Indigenous laws, because as was the theme at the IUCN, without doing that, the world is really basically not going to be very well into the future. So when you're really sick, right? So, and in the work that we do as practitioners in this space is really about, well, how can we make better use as Indigenous people of science and decision-making to support this application of better ecological management on the earth, right? And so science can support that a lot. And so that's empowering, and that's sort of towards this idea that indigenization is a concept that needs to be embraced if we're going to have a more equal society, a better, a healthier world, et cetera, those things I mentioned at the outset. And next slide. So, I mean, this is, for me, the essence of the conflict, right? And things take time, and it will, the point of ethical space is to begin this understanding and to understand where each of us may be and what we can do towards absorbing some of these understandings, thinking in our own minds what they mean to our particular work, and understanding that there's these differences. And why would, and when you're thinking about it, why would any particular system be any more valid and credible than the other, right? Because we live in an assumption in Western society that the system we've developed is good and valid and credible and certainly has good elements, bring those forward into ethical space, but it's just one manifestation of the infinite possibilities that exist for social structures in the universe, right? So why would we, if we're comparing these, like, why would one be better than the other? It's just, it's not. This is my point, right? We try, and this is not an objective point of view, but when we start considering that, it really begins to have us question our assumptions about our own societies and why we do the things we do, right? And so for me, policy is a little frustrating. I do policy work, but I know that there's limitations. So I'm constantly saying, well, we understand as Indigenous people, these are limitations, and that your system, while you believe it's valid and credible, doesn't carry the same weight for our systems. And this is a thing that's going to take time. There's a lot more, like every topic area, every relationship, every geography will have its own Indigenous traditions that need to be deeply understood. And there's continued work by lots of practitioners, including myself, and I know James, in terms of developing supports and mechanisms to help people move through these types of processes, right? It's really important. Next slide. So this is just one slide I like to add, and it's a bit messy, but it's to describe that there's another inverse set of way of thinking in many Indigenous societies. So if you reflect back on the slide, we were just thinking about, like, the weight of that Earth observation-based knowledge basically carries no weight on the Western side and basically carries all of the weight on the Indigenous side. They're inverse. They're basically inverse, right? This is another one. So I do lots of work in planning, and a lot of the ideas now around theories of change, I would begin to think about in the context of Indigenous decision-making and non-Indigenous decision-making. So we as environmental organizations, we as governments, we as universities, we as consortiums of people who want to do good, think about theories of change and how we're going to change things, right? So we think about, well, the decisions we make will influence the outcome of a system. And I do that on sort of the social side, but a lot of my work is natural resources. So it's like, well, planners, managers, politicians, individuals are thinking, well, if I make this particular change, say they want to pollute a water body. So the question is, well, if we allow this discharge, we'll pollute the water. It'll have lower water quality. If we don't allow this discharge, the water will be more pristine. So you see, we make a decision, there's an outcome to the system. And that's the way we do things. And I know I have the science kind of degree, and it's like that. But on the Indigenous side, I'm finding through my work, and as I gain in my understanding of different traditions and stuff, is that indeed that's also inverse. In the case of Indigenous societies, often the decisions are a reflection of the system. So in the case of water quality, for example, a lot of Indigenous traditions think that water is alive, right? And there's certain protocols and responsibilities and ceremonies that are taught to ensure that aliveness and that quality continue. And there's certain requirements in terms of water purity, for example, that are required in order to keep water in a healthy state. And, you know, the water may tell them, or other animals may tell through story, et cetera. But the point is, the water says, I need to be clean. And so the decision being made by the people is consistent with what the system is telling the people. So when you think about decisions in that way, humans would not, if you followed a system or a story-based set of protocols, you would be less likely to make decisions which impact that system negatively. So that's another essence of some of the fundamental difference in worldviews you often hear, but really it's an inverse way of thinking about decisions that are made on the land, which is essentially why you have Indigenous territories which have 80% of the biodiversity left, have some clean water, that kind of stuff, right? And so again, in terms of ethical space, it's understanding and wrapping our minds around, you know, we assume that planning theory of change is a good thing, right? And it may be, could have good results, but it's different from the way decisions are made on the Indigenous side. Typically, there's always people and communities who choose to do different things. So again, this is, you know, some of those considerations about a more traditionally minded groups of Indigenous people. Yeah, so then in ethical space too, it's in the planning. Well, really the exploration of assumptions, I think, is my most important message through this conversation. So next slide. So I talked a little bit about what does this mean for us who are doing work? Well, this question is for you to ponder, like, how will you understand your work and future work within this context? Like, I know many of you are scientists, and science is wonderful. There's no disparagement of science, the process of observing the earth and making conclusions. The challenge is how much weight that has, right? And if we're doing this earth observation and we want to work with Indigenous people, how do we understand that structural use of that information, right? And that's the point, it's very different. So hopefully this has been somewhat illuminating in terms of what those things may be. When you're seeking to work with Indigenous knowledge practitioners, it's not just about facts and unobjective, unbiased research and conclusions, although a lot of times you'll find the same conclusions between science and Indigenous knowledge, but it's about reconciling law with non-law, right? Okay, next slide. So I mentioned this sort of pragmatic approach in terms of, well, we're all doing our work. We're all influencers of our common destiny. So what do we do, and how do we understand what roles we can play? Like I mentioned, I can do a little policy work. I can learn more stories. I can apply agreements that reflect Indigenous law in the same, in an equal way with constitutional law, for example. There's this idea, well, Constitution Act or the National Parks Act in Canada or the Endangered Species Act in the States. What are those equivalent laws or stories in Indigenous societies which sort of have the similar way of constraining behavior, right? So maybe it's a certain story from, in the Okanagan case, sort of, it's called Chaptique, right? There's various stories which help us guide behavior. So we're like, okay, in the National Parks Act, for example, like we're going to not harvest, we're going to do all these various things which will, in our idea, conserve ecology. What are those same stories that provide that same type of guidance, but from the Indigenous side, that we can draw upon and create parity and agreements with the other governments? So that's really when we're talking about collaborative governance or co-governance. There's so much work to do on understanding what those governing elements are on Indigenous society, and they're all within story. But it's understanding that, and then how do we work with that? So if you're a negotiator, you can incorporate those stories in their equivalency with, not with American or Canadian or whoever's law, right? If you're a scientist, understanding that this idea that pulling Indigenous knowledge into a scientific document or plan will somehow be useful. I mean, it may, but understand that it's really about a subjugation, right, of Indigenous law to a policy validation feedback. Because in science, we hope, as scientists, we all hope that our work will influence something. And usually that's a political, we can get a policy change or all that kind of stuff, right? So just recognizing that nuance is, I think, important. Yeah, and then a principle-based approach, like really, as we think about what ethical space offers us in terms of this opportunity for trustworthy dialogue through bringing these kinds of things forward, I really understand the significance of the knowledge of whether it's individual knowledge from an individual person you're working with, or a whole group or a set of stories. I understand when I'm working with this knowledge, I understand the significance of it for that particular group, right? And then always, as we move towards more equality in our society, that there continue to be disparities in capacity between non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, even in science and all that kind of stuff. And then things take trust and they take time, right? And I think that's just the way it is. And it's a point that's reiterated. It's all about relationship. And I'll end with this next slide, which I really like a quote. I don't know this person, J. Krishnamurti, but I really like this. It says, action has meaning only in relationship. And without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict. The understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than a search for any plan of action. So I hope, in this presentation, that this building of relationship needs to be based on deep understanding. This presentation offered a little bit of my perspective on what some of that deep understanding needs to include in terms of those structural elements and legislative components. But whatever level you go forward on, these are really important, so that action, the key point here is action breeds conflict unless you have this relationship, right? And I think, and what does relationship mean? And I would just reiterate, well, I think it means being able to move through these sets of dialogues which explore and expand and explode assumptions, right? So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you for listening. I do appreciate it.
Hi, Gwen. Thank you very much for that tremendous presentation. We have a number of questions for you in the chat. So I'll try to read them for you, Gwen, here. So one was from Kelly. She says, exploration of assumptions as most important, a big yes. I made the same point in presentation on ethical space yesterday. Would love to hear more about your experiences in exploring this in practical ways with people and organizations and institutions who are interested in ethical space, but too busy, quote, too busy or too whatever to take time, space, resources, pause, etc., needed to understand this more deeply.
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge. I was just editing a Planning West, it's a British Columbia Institute of Planners magazine, right? About what, and I was thinking about this topic, what planners need to do to move forward in relationship and all that kind of stuff, right? And one of the assumptions within that article was that, all those planners will be paid to do that work, right? They'll be doing it on the clock, essentially, right? And I think, and then, so what is the assumption that we're making about how that Indigenous person is getting paid, what their role and responsibility is, right? And so I think that we begin to explore some of those assumptions, and we all need to take more opportunity. And again, I'm not sure how this will work in terms of how we begin to evolve this notion of relationship in our working lives to be more expansive than just tasks and duties and projects and all of that kind of stuff, deliverables, et cetera, right? And I'm working through this too with some of the, there's the notion of management, especially natural resource management. If we're enabling and moving out of the way to observe Indigenous management becoming reinvigorized, reestablished on the land base, it's a completely different sort of social mechanism which allows management to happen. Right? Like we have projects, we have project plans, we have project teams, we have budgets, we have all of these deliverables, all those kinds of things. So we're learning to shift into basically, when I said living at the bottom of that thing, it's like a way of life. That what we're doing when we're endorsing, or not we, but this emerges, is that it's a way of life, right? And that has to get funded. And so it's a fundamentally different view. And when I was at IUCN, I was really heartened to hear and hopeful that President Macron said, well, we need a new paradigm for capitalism, right? And so I think this part of the question that you're asking is, well, we need to be paid to develop relationships across all fronts, right? And that's different, but there's hope, because if we're stuck in our set of assumptions about deliverables and timelines, that's non-Indigenous. Indigenous is about doing the life, right? And so that's, I think, not an eloquent answer, but I think there's this evolution towards, being paid to have these relationships, because those relationships and watching how the relationship with the land through Indigenous management happens results in good things. No different than a set of techs going out and doing water quality monitoring.
Well, Gwen, we have a chat from a guy named Andy Clemach, who said, Gwen, you're awesome.
Thanks, Andy.
That's
Appreciate
good.
you taking the time.
Another question from Sarah Harper. At what point is bringing Indigenous values forward in natural resource management plans considered appropriation instead of, for example, TwoEyed Scene?
Yeah, I think always, basically, is my point. But what we can do when we're talking about natural resource management plans, because natural resource management plans have limited weight if you look at the little hierarchy, right? Where do they fit in? They're not the highest level of the law, right? There's all kinds of those legislative constraints which influence natural resource management plans. We know that, right? They're always compromised. So I would say that, yeah, indeed, there's no way around that. What can happen, though, is those plans can support Indigenous management. They can support Indigenous application of traditional principles on that same land base. But until the essence of my work over the last 20 something years is like, well, until some of these things change, we're going to be sort of spinning our wheels, right? But I think as you're working on natural resource management planning, which will continue and is a good thing, is just an acknowledgement, like bring that plan to this space and say, I know this plan is subject to all of the assumptions that are contained within the Western system, but here it is. How can we have the conversation about it? I understand and acknowledge it doesn't have the equal weight to what you're what Indigenous law says. So those types of conversations, I think, are really important. Transparency is a good thing.
We have a question from my good friend Maureen McCarty. She says, Gwen, can you give us some insight into how to think about carbon credit trading involving ecosystem management by tribes using the ethical space concept?
Yeah, I'm trying to negotiate a carbon project for Lower Smilkme, one of my clients in Canada. And it's a challenge. I think one of the and I don't know much about it. I'm certainly not a carbon expert or anything. I'm just trying to sort of advance this project. But it's really important. I think it's all couched in Indigenous management, right? So there's a tension, and this is probably a longer kind of discussion, but there's this tension between these project-specific initiatives and solutions which can be developed within the sort of management parameters or framework or policy constraints that are already in place. And that one of them includes this carbon trading, carbon financing for ecosystem-based solutions. And that's great, and we should all move forward on that. Indigenous nations, I'm finding, are like, well, we want to view things from a holistic perspective, include carbon trading, include food sovereignty, include subsistence, include all of these types of things, right? So they're kind of taking their worldview and trying to parse it out to these various initiatives. But I think when I talked about economic considerations, it's really, really important to try and think about building new Indigenous and other sustainable economies. And that could include carbon financing. It's going to be essential to enable Indigenous people to do the management. One of the themes out of the IUCN is like, well, if we're asking them to do all this management now, a little bit of pressure, we're going to have to pay for it, right? So, and carbon credits is one of those options. And I think it's a good one because some of the laws and policies already exist on the Western side. So I don't know if that answers, but that's a statement. Good,
very good. We have a question from Reb Bryant. The question is, what role do you think early career researchers, particularly graduate students in science, can take on in collaborations as folks within less institutional power and less time within a local community?
You mean like they have less time to engage, or I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
What role do you think early career can take on collaborations with less power? It sounds like, if you're an early career researcher and you're maybe working within Indigenous communities who have less institutional power or less time, how would you advise or think about preparing early career researchers, in particular, like with ethical space, TwoEyed Scene? Are there things in place now where they can get involved in?
Well, I think that there's methodologies being developed for how you can create efficiencies in the Indigenous engagement process. And those are important to probably reflect upon, because there's certain things that you need to do in order to, that you can do on your own, you can do quickly and efficiently to advance having those conversations. So often in today's world, as I mentioned before, there's imperatives, moral and legal imperatives to want to engage with Indigenous people, but people go out and they're like, oh, we need to engage, like, how do we have a relationship? But there's a whole lot of preparatory work you can do before that. So I think that as we're evolving training, schools, education systems, we can begin to learn some of those things, and we'll have a much better grounding for our understanding and how to have those conversations, which will create efficiencies, great efficiencies when we're having those conversations. Again, hopefully that was a little bit helpful. But yeah, my email is gwen@gwenbridge.com if you do want to follow up on that particular question. Happy to.
That's great. We have another question from Ellison Scott. Allison says, natural resource agencies are bound by the laws and legal processes of their state, county. She says, regardless of information from science or traditional knowledge, do you have any advice for incorporating Indigenous principles or honoring relationships with Indigenous communities when working within the constraints of these systems?
Yeah, again, the acknowledgement of the system, we all know systems don't change overnight, right? So one of the things, I'm actually working with the province of BC, and they want to do good things. And it's like, well, you want to do good things and you go out with a principle-based approach. Oh, we want to listen and do good things, but identifying exactly where those points are that are the impasse, right, within your particular provincial or state legislation. We can't go past this because of legislation B or structural component X or whatever, right? So that's really important, because then we can begin as people who are engaged in society, as potential legislators, as policymakers, to really begin to break down those particular components, which are indeed those impediments specifically, right? And I know it's not all going to be great. There's not sweeping change, but those types of incremental things are really important. Also, going forth to the Indigenous nations with a principle-based approach as far as you can take it within your organization, with the acknowledgement that you're doing your best within these constraints is, again, just super important. People understand, even within Indigenous communities, there's constraints of in one kind or another, right? And there's no perfection here. I don't think that I alluded to that, but we're all just trying to do our best. Yeah, that's that.
Okay. Another question for you. How do we tie in the concept of future actions into all of this, such as changing landscapes and projects that may already be in motion out of our control as scientists? How should this be communicated in Indigenous systems that are earth-based and informed by the present? How can we fit TEK into shifting landscapes? Question.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to not only do we observe the earth to gain answers, we can observe societies to gain answers, right? And I'm not really sure, because I haven't thought too much about that, but this concept of yeah, and there's all these constraints, right? It's like, well, you have a project underway, the Indigenous nation says it should be done differently, but there's kind of all of these things that are already rolling along. There's a lot of examples of that. And what's typically happening, and a lot of projects that are undergoing Canadian environmental assessment review process, for example, have to reimagine their pathway forward, whether it's in their recovery plans or their restoration plans, or it's in their sort of near-term or interim mechanisms. And so those conversations happen between the proponent and/or government and the Indigenous nation. And the Indigenous nation brings forward those kinds of things, and the onus is on the government and the proponent to incorporate those things. And a lot of my legal colleagues fight these battles where those things weren't appropriately included. So the legal system can be utilized effectively as well in some of these ideas or some of these challenges or issues or problems.
Yeah, Gwen, we have 5 more minutes. I feel like ask Gwen. This is kind of an ask Gwen advice. We have a question here about legal perspectives. Gwen, do you think Western legal perspectives and practices understand Indigenous laws are often communicated through story and have equal weight as any nation laws? If not, any suggestions for how we get there? How can we help grow understanding with our legal Western advisors, policymakers, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. Lots of components to that question. Wish I could actually see that question because there's like at least 3 parts and I'm not, I don't keep things in my head that good. But anyways, the legal traditions, right? So I'll just talk about what I know in terms of what's happening in Canada and British Columbia in particular, is that Indigenous nations are articulating their laws in a way which can be understood by non-Indigenous practitioners, including state government lawyers and stuff like that, right? So there's this work to move through the story, and West Coast Environmental Law is actually working with them on the implementation of a water law that was developed by the Indigenous Law Research Unit out of University of Victoria. So they have a bunch of practitioners to go and work with community to explore the stories and draw the legal principles out of those stories and communicate them effectively to non-Indigenous people, lawyers, whomever, right? So there is that work going on. It's beginning in British Columbia, but it's going to be very effective, and it's a big trend that Indigenous nations will begin to do that. The weight it carries is really interesting. In British Columbia and Canada, we talked about the commitment of the governments, which is awesome, to implement UNDRIP and through legislation, right? So what's happening is when you think about UNDRIP, and if you're saying the UNDRIP says all of your laws are rights and we're going to uphold them, or we're going to acknowledge and respect them, that whole set of legal framework and structure comes into play, right? And so what it provides us is this expanding of what is typically a legal box, a westernized legal box, and it begins to expand it to include these other components. So it's a burgeoning and creative area of law, and I know you don't often get creativity with law, but it really is. I think it's just like this gray area that is expanding, and we don't know what it will look like. I think it's a huge opportunity. So I think I answered 2 of those 2 components of that question.
Good job, Gwen. Well, let's do 2 more questions. I know Sally Ann Sims been holding up her hand. I hope your hand's not too tired, Sally. But do you have a question for Gwen or a comment?
Yes, thank you. I'll put my hand down eventually. Gwen, this is great. And I think the last time we had a little conversation about this, you had mentioned that you had spoken with your colleagues about the influence of corporations on the left side of that issue of creating ethical space. And I was wondering, as we're taking this conversation broadly beyond our organizations, do you see ways of dealing with the influence that corporations have on so many of those things on the left side in terms of policies and legislation, the kind of the outsized influence of that, and how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can move forward to create this vision that we have?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things probably there. One is the goodwill of corporations, which sounds facetious, but is really is undertaking a movement because our climate is in peril, right? So they acknowledge that, and there's these challenges which do need to be resolved through corporate with the participation of the corporate sector, no doubt. So they're starting to do this. And then secondly, the social license, right? Like, and sort of this global consideration of, well, if we're looking to Indigenous people, you corporations better not be impacting them anymore. That's not necessarily in policy, but that's a nascent sort of sentiment, I think. And then thirdly, I would say the legal stuff in terms of, as we become more explicit about the need to be consistent with UNDRIP in Canada and elsewhere, and other Indigenous and other orders, the legal component remains really important, I think, for that.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you, Gwen. And I know we're coming up on time here. So there's a lot of questions, Gwen, a lot of really great comments. They're thanking you for your presentation, awesome presentation. So remember, this presentation is recorded. And also the questions, Gwen, if you wanted to share your email again with people, if they want to follow up with you directly.
I'll put it in the chat.
put it in the chat. And so with that, I just want to, can we all give Gwen a hand? All right.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
Thanks for
this is
listening.
great.
Appreciate
And
it.
then also, before I let you all go here, we have our next webinar coming up. So Gwen, thank you again for your great presentation. At this point, I sort of wanted to say that our next webinar will be October 15th. We Dr. Margaret Redsteer. It'll be a great talk again. She is going to be the lead author for the Indigenous chapter of the National Climate Assessment. And so we'll get to hear a little bit about that as well as their great title here today. So first of all, I want to, and finally, I want to thank everybody for participating. This has been a great webinar again. Thank you, Gwen, for a last minute ask and to come through as you do. You're a professional, and hope things are good in Canada. Hope the smoke is cleared and all that good stuff that needs to happen. So thank you, everybody, for attending the webinar. We're going to sign off here. I want to say Wopi Latanka, Ichichi Apalo. We'll sign off now. Thank you all very much. Take care and have a safe day. Bye.